Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about raising cross-cultural kids. This is hosted by Indigro along with Parenting Culture, and we have a very, very esteemed panel to discuss all things raising cross-cultural kids today. So I'm just going to quickly introduce everybody here and then let everyone introduce themselves as well. So we have Dr. Anjali Ferguson, who's a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma-informed care, early childhood, mental health, and parenting. We also have Hadi Garcia, who's a clinical psychologist specializing in, correct me if I'm wrong, providing therapy and assessment services to children and young adults. We have Ariana Howitt, who's a clinical assistant professor of pediatrics at Nationwide Children's Hospital and the Ohio State University, juggling all things. And we have Akila Das Bla, who's chief storyteller and content head at Indigro, and I am Kshama, who's also a founder and chief of all things, like I like to call it, because who else at Indigro Kids. So we're joining you from a couple of states in the U.S., Bangalore and Singapore. So it's truly a multicultural panel here. And I'm just going to go around the room and just ask everybody to tell us a little bit about their background and their life experience, which has sort of led us all to be here and almost have this conversation, right? So I'll start. So I'm Kshama. I was raised in India and I lived in a few other countries before meeting my South African husband, Richard, and we raised our son, Neil, here in Singapore. And this sort of cross-cultural experience is what inspired me to start Indigro, which is an early culture learning platform. So that's me. Anjali, do you want to maybe take over?
Sure. Hi, everyone. First, I'm really excited to be here, and I really appreciate Indigro for having this conversation. My name is Anjali Ferguson. I'm a clinical psychologist, as Shama mentioned. I am a second parents immigrated to the United States right before I was born. I was born here, but we returned to India for a couple of years of my childhood. So I've lived in Bangalore for a few years, and we moved back when I was in 5th grade, 5th standard. And I then grew up here and had a lot of kind of experiences with acculturation and differences in parenting that really kind of prompted my interest in becoming a psychologist that specializes in parenting. And then throughout my journey here in the States, I met my husband, who's a Black man, and we've been together 15 years now, but we've had a lot of conversations around culture, which started to really inform the work that I do. And also now we have a child, which is now informing our own parenting. And when we started our parenting journey, actually, before we started our parenting journey, I spoke with some of my colleagues here, and many of our conversations were around how we didn't feel represented in the parenting space, and our experience didn't really feel represented in the parenting space. And we wanted to acknowledge how diverse and how rich and very different cultural experiences are. So we created parenting culture. And this is 3 of the 5 of us that are part of the team. But we each bring our own lens, our own experiences, our own cultural background to the information that we create from a evidence-based research standpoint in our individual expertise and lived experiences. And then we bring in how and when we are tackling challenges with our own children to the platform too. So that's a little bit about parenting culture, how that started, and then also about my journey.
Thank you. Hadi, can we hear from you?
Sure. I would like to call myself a 1.5 generation immigrant here. I was actually born in Puerto Rico to Dominican parents. And then I came to the United States and was raised in North Carolina when I was around 5 years old. So I grew up in the US. I did learn Spanish first. And so I've always kind of been in that multicultural environment, especially being a Caribbean Latinx female in the South, which at that time was honestly growing up, I didn't know that many people that shared my background in North Carolina. And as I got older, I became so much more aware of just so many differences just with my peers. And then I went to college and found some really close friends who shared more of my ethnic background. And I think that's when I really started thinking about how my experiences growing up, specifically just thinking about some of my Dominican friends from New York versus me in North Carolina, and how much of a difference that made for us, and just experiences in general. In college, I met my husband, who's a Black male from Virginia. And now we have a 3-year-old, adorable little thing that asks a lot of questions, daughter who's brilliant. And I think I've always had these conversations about what I wanted to teach my children, but having a little girl who is darker than me, who has different hair than me, I realized how important it was to make sure that she felt confidence in herself and understood her background. Um, and that's hard because she asks so many questions, and it's so hard to navigate the questions that she asks, especially as she gets older. But that's along with just my general interest. I think that's definitely why I wanted to be part of parenting culture. And so in professionally, I think it's so important when children have a nice sense of their identity and have that self-confidence, because it is a protective factor, from my opinion, for a lot of different things. And so I don't think I missed anything, but that's basically me in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. That's a very interesting background. And I think we're all going through a little bit of the asking questions phase. My son just turned 4 as well. So yeah, very, very, very familiar territory. Thank you so much. Ariana, can we get a little bit of your background, your story, and why you do what you do?
So I was born in Venezuela. I was there until I was 8, moved to Ohio with my parents, and then my brother was born here. We lived here for 5 years while my dad was a graduate student, and then we moved back again to Venezuela when I was 13. We were there for 2 years and came back again. So it was pretty easy until we came back when I was 15. I think that was the really hard transition. I had really felt connected to my family and friends in Venezuela and the culture there. And so coming back, even though I spoke the language and had lived here before, that was a really, really hard time. So I think that's experience more of that acculturation and acculturation gap, and having a hard time adjusting. And so I met Anjali in graduate school. I was fortunate to overlap with her for a few years, and I started working with primarily immigrant families in the last 2.5 years. And that's when I've noticed the gap of the research and the therapies that are out there are not created for a lot of the immigrant families. And so I often feel like I don't know the evidence. I don't know what to give these that I know is research-based. And so that's where I've had a lot of conversations with Anjali and what do you recommend? What do you think about this? And so I was super happy about the idea of parenting culture.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to move on to Akhila as well. And this is kind of bridges to our first question on kind of defining cross-cultural children, but I'll let Akhila introduce herself first.
So hi, so I'm Akhila. So my kind of background is a bit different. I'm what I would define as a domestic cross-cultural kid. So my dad was in the Navy in India, and that meant every 2 years we traveled. Every 2 years we shifted to a new part, culture again. So you learn as a child to adapt and to be resilient, but you also are a bit of a chameleon because you're constantly kind of watching and seeing, okay, what does this environment expect of me now? So that's something that I never felt like I ever really belonged in any one particular place because we were on the move a lot. On paper, I'm Indian. Domestically, when you travel from the north, south, east, west, the languages are different, culture is completely different, the food is completely different, the cultural nuances are different. So it all kind of seeps into, what you experience as a child. That was my childhood growing up. I've then, got married again. I come from the south of India, technically. My husband comes from the northeast. So again, extremely different backgrounds. So we're raising my children. I've got 3 boys, much older than your kids at this point. They're 14 and 11. But again, it's been a struggle in terms of finding common language, finding common commonalities in terms of we celebrate festivals or food or anything that, when we're raising kids together. So for me, Indigrow, this journey that I've been on has been with Shama is very personal as well, because it is something that I felt that we lacked as an early childhood educator. Having taught in different environments, it's something that we found that was not being addressed enough. There wasn't enough content out there that was addressing these issues that children are facing, both and this was something that I felt that was lacking both as an educator as well as a parent. So for me, being on board with Shama and doing this with Indigrow has really kind of given us a lot of faith and belief that this is needed. These kind of conversations in the world around us is needed, and at all levels, not just, in pockets.
Thank you, Akhila. I just want to spend a bit of time on what you guys believe cross-cultural children are, because we were talking about it as we launch our early culture learning platform. Just going beyond our books and games, which currently represent India and Singapore, but we want to grow into becoming a more global early culture learning platform. And we're sort of the opinion is that literally everybody, irrespective of where you are raising cross-cultural kids, you don't have to have married someone from a different ethnic background, or you don't have to be from 2 different parts of the same country. You can be as well. Even that is actually raising cross-cultural kids, because ultimately, as long as your child is influenced by a different environment in a small or a big way, that's what cross-cultural children are. So we're actually amazed a lot of the times at how parents and our community around us actually doesn't realize that. So the need to, raise more open-minded kids. So I just maybe want to hear, I'll start with you, Anjali, just go from left to right. Maybe what is your definition of a cross-cultural kid? Would you say, just you go ahead and define it for yourself.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I talk about culture as every person brings their individual culture into every room they walk into. Doesn't matter the color of your skin, the language you speak, like all of those things inform our individual perspective lens, how we were raised, where we were raised, the foods we eat, the religions we practice. So every single one of us, even in the United States, we talk about white individuals or white culture as kind of the norm or baseline. Even white people bring culture, right? So as you said, Shama, you don't have to marry somebody from a different culture to experience cross-cultural experiences. They happen day to day. And I think especially in this day and age where diversity and variability is increasing with our population, and is giving us access to so many different voices and story types of people. I think it's really important as parents, we be cognizant of that, because it's important our children kind of have the knowledge of how to encounter differences and how to speak to their differences and have pride and confidence in their differences. So that to me is what I think of when I think cross-cultural.
Yeah. Hadi or Ariane, do you want to add? Either of you want to add anything to that? I think she summarized it sort of perfectly.
Absolutely. I agree with everything she was saying. And just from my experience with my 3-year-old, she'll come home and she has this best friend, and she'll just randomly say, well, he does this. And it's really different than what we do at home. And I have to kind of explain to her, that's their house. And when they're at their house, you're allowed to do that. At my house, we're not allowed to do that. And it's so you can see it very early that I think I think I saw a post you guys put up recently about like when you go one grandparent's house is different than the other grandparent's house. And I think that it just speaks to so much how culture can vary just by environment and where you're at. And even if you think about kind of code switching, like that by itself, which is just kind of shifting the way you speak and the way you act depending on who you're around, to me that's also culture. And I think again, culture is so broad, and I do think that people don't recognize the nuances of what culture is and how it's everywhere, no matter where you're at or who you're with.
Yeah, you can be of the same community, live 2 minutes away across from the street from each other, and the nuances of culture are completely, completely different. Ariana, maybe let me ask you this question, and then I'll ask everyone else to contribute as well. Some of the common issues that, you know, children face, um, what do you think they are, and what are some of the tips and tricks to sort of help them navigate it? I'll give you one example. Like my son, so my husband's white South African, so my son's a lighter color than me. So, you know, someone at school asked him why your mom looks different, you know, so why, and he asked me, he's like, Mama, why don't I look like you? You know, we navigated it and we spoke about it, but it was, you know, for someone who's not aware, it can come as like a startling discussion if you're not prepared for it. So yeah, so Ariane, let me start with you, and any tips and tricks of navigating these kind of conversations across the spectrum, right? Because it's not just looks, it's clothes you wear, it's things you celebrate, it's the food you maybe bring in your lunchbox, it's maybe the things that you listen to, absolutely anything, right? Your accent, the way you speak, all of those things. And these things sort of are discussed so much now in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space in the corporate world. But these things start like now in the playroom, right? So anything that, you know, we can keep in mind in terms of helping kids and parents navigate this.
You're absolutely right with saying it starts now, right? Since the infant months, kids are noticing differences. We as humans categorize, we notice those differences in what people look like, how they dress, how they behave. They may just not have the language. They may not have the understanding. And so as parents, our role can be to talk about it, give them the words, give them the language, talk about, yes, there are different, but you know, everyone's still unique and good, and highlight positive of those differences, and then the similarities too, what makes us humans, right? So I think books and movies and going to cultural events, talking about friends at school and what they're seeing, what are kids saying to them, because sometimes maybe they'll feel too shy to bring it up. I know that was something we experienced with my brother. He's 10 years younger, and he would experience things about, for example, why my mom wasn't being talked to at the karate class. All the US parents were talking to each other and they never talked to my mom. And he took that to be, oh, is she weird? Is there something wrong? And so it was a positive conversation when they were able to talk about it and talk about, well, the language barrier, just the cultural barrier. And so those open conversations can be really helpful.
Great, thanks. Akhila, can I ask you to weigh in on this? Any sort of tips and tricks that parents can keep in mind?
So I think that for me, one of the other things that we can do is to empower our kids to have these conversations, because one aspect, of course, is us talking to them, and that's, you know, the parent talking to the child. But a lot of the times our children are facing it themselves directly, peer to peer, and that's where actually the struggle comes in, because they don't know how to have that conversation. How do I explain why I don't look like my mom? How do I explain why the food that I'm eating is different from what you're eating? Or I battle those stereotypes, or you know, the comment on the differences, right? And I think that when we have these conversations with our children, but if we give them the tools to have the conversations themselves, that gives them that feeling of, you know, just empowerment, right? For you know, to things like to say that, you know, someone else's yuck is someone else's yum, or, you know, or to say things like, you know, if you don't want it, that's fine, more for me. You know, it just gives them that little bit of self-confidence in that ability to have those conversations. A personal incident, I remember that my little one, you know, he loves wearing bangles, right? And culturally, you know, it in India and or anywhere across the world, you know, sometimes they feel that, you know, boys shouldn't wear accessories, or they made fun for wearing accessories, right? And I remember that, he was so blissfully oblivious to the stares and the looks and the thing he was getting. And it was making my blood boil, and I had to really kind of like hold myself in and, ensure that his zone of staying confident, that self-confidence, and hold on to it, and making sure that he felt comfortable enough. And, we talked about it and we said that, people may not kind of appreciate it, but that's okay. They don't want to wear bangles, that's on them. And that conversation allowed him for, I think there was dress up day a few months later, and he chose to wear flowers, and he made this little headdress with flowers and he wore it. And I was so worried that he would be teased or something, but he was like, I mean, a couple of kids said something, but I don't really care what their opinion is because it made me happy. So I think that as parents, part of it, we want to protect them, which is great, but we also need to empower them. And I think that should be our focus, because we can't always fight their battles.
Yeah. And also, I think things like what you said, right? If parents had the tools and kids had the tools to say things, or we were prepared enough to say, your yuck is my yum, or, or my yuck is your yum, is that it? What is the yuck yum thing? I find that quite interesting. Or like literally tools to say, oh, don't worry, there's more for me. They're tools to say quick things that can be quite catchy for both parents and kids. I think that's very helpful too. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is I find it quite interesting that a lot of these conversations, like I said earlier, tend to happen or tend to start when kids face issues. So in their teenage years, when it's already gone inside them, and it's always sort of stuck there. And then it's coming out at different points in time in their life. And then it's after it's been ingrained that you're sort of dealing with it, after they've technically been affected. So maybe I'll sort of ask Anjali and Hadi to sort of start on this, is why is it important to start this in the formative years, in the early childhood years? So when should we start having these conversations? Why should we start having these conversations of confidence? We've spoken a little bit about it, but what I want to discuss is, what should we watch out for when kids are little? Sometimes, like Ariana was saying, they don't say, they're hesitant. So what are the things we should watch out for? What should we keep in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ariana said this, but identity development starts as early as 6 months of age. We don't recognize that or notice that as adults because our kids don't have that language, but there are different periods in development where they do express these things, right? Akila, when you were mentioning your son, I'm going to take a guess that that was around 4 to 7 years of age that was happening, because that's another moment where kids are exploring gender identity and trying out different things. Then again, in adolescence, it happens where kids are exploring their identity, and several times through adulthood. So there are moments kids are showing us and just naturally going through these phases. So it's important that as adults, we start this early. My husband and I have conversations, we've had conversations about our different cultures, different backgrounds, what our individual identities mean to us and what we want to represent with our son ever since he was born, with the books that he has, the media that he watches. And we're very vocal about, yeah, mommy's from India, daddy's Black, that means you're Black and Indian. And he might not completely comprehend that right now, but he's getting the language, he's getting the exposure. And we are recognizing that those differences are a part of him and we're normalizing it. I think part of the difficulty is for adults, these types of conversations make us uncomfortable because we don't have a roadmap. We don't have in our histories people helping us build that confidence that Akila spoke of. And I even think back to, I've had the classic experience of taking curry to lunch at school and people being like, ew, what is that? And ridiculing me. When we know Indian food is like the best food on the planet. So, but I didn't have the confidence to say that, or to say, do you want to try some? You'll be impressed. And I didn't build that confidence until adulthood, because even in college people would say things. Even my husband, when he first tried it, he was like, what is that, and now when people still make comments about the smell or the way it looks, I have that built-in confidence instead of feeling anxious about what do I say, how do I say it. But that took time for me to develop on my own. What would be great is if we gave our kids those tools, again, like Akila was mentioning, early on, so when they do face these things, they feel more confident and pride in their culture, which helps promote that identity that's protected, as Hadi had mentioned earlier on too.
Yeah. So Hadi, can I ask you what are the things that parents must notice in kids? And do they get quiet? Do they sort of start avoiding things? Do they make snarky comments? Is it all of the above? Like, what are the markers, so to speak?
I would say. I think just to really quickly add to what Anjali was saying, I think culturally, adults tend to try to be polite and not kind of ask questions that may make other people uncomfortable. Kids are curious. So like we'll be at a grocery store, my daughter will, why is this happening? Or why is that person doing that? I remember going to the Luray Caverns in Virginia, and we had told her, hey, don't touch anything you're not supposed to. And adults in front of us were touching the wall. And she very loudly say, Mommy, why are they touching the wall? And my immediate, I know this is kind of different, but my immediate response was like, oh my gosh, we don't know. Like, don't ask that right now. And I think that is such a very typical reaction when there is an uncomfortable question in public, but that's one way where you can catch yourself. Am I uncomfortable? And could this actually be an opportunity for me to say, hey, like, this is just something that some people choose to do, or, like normalizing those differences that they may be pointing out. In terms of what to notice when they're having a hard time, I think any major behavior change, your kids best and their behavior. So if you have a kid that's very talkative and all of a sudden they're quieter, or a child who's pretty easygoing and then having more tantrums. I recently had this experience with my daughter where for a week she was getting in trouble at school. She was hitting, the teachers were, and I was like, what is going on? And I can't necessarily tell you what was happening, but there was so much change going on around her. And this wasn't related to anything negative that she was experiencing culturally wise at school by any means. But I think those were signs that you can look for anytime there is a major shift in behavior for your child. And again, that could look very different depending on your child and can shift as they get older or when they're younger, especially as they develop more language for expressing what they're feeling. And even then they may not, especially in adolescence. But I would say definitely any major behavior change that you see in your child could indicate that they're thinking about something. And opening the conversation. Every time my daughter comes home from school, I ask her, how was school? Who'd you play with? What'd you talk about? And sometimes she'll say things and I'm like, oh, well, what happened? Tell me what he said. Tell me what she said. And a lot of conversations. We've had conversations about her hair because of that. Because she said, well, I wanted my hair. I think she pulled it and she said, I want my hair long like yours, Mommy. And her hair is really, really curly. And we had a conversation like, hey, like your hair is awesome too. And we actually started talking about her hair having magic. And she has ran with that. And she will say, my hair has magic, Mommy, and use that magic everywhere. And I love it. But kind of having that conversation with her literally started from me just asking her how her day at school was. And she's only 3. So making sure you're opening that conversation with them even early on when you may not think they understand.
Yeah, great. Ariana, Akila, anything to add?
So I think I would just add one more thing in terms of just sharing your own stories, your own childhood stories. I think that opens the door to a lot of conversations as well, because what I've found is that when we share our personal experiences, obviously age appropriate, for our little ones, but it allows, it kind of creates that little bit of that relatability window to say that, this happened to me. So even if it hasn't, if your child has experienced it creates an opportunity for them to share their experience. But if they haven't experienced it yet, then at least it kind of stored somewhere in the back of their mind saying that, okay, they face this as well. So I feel comfortable coming and telling them it's not going to upset them. I think one of the big things that children carry with them is this fear of upsetting or hurting their parents, right? There's a lot of stuff that they don't want to disclose, not because, they don't want to be honest about it or they don't want to kind of share or communicate, but sometimes they just I mean, as protective as we are of our children, they're equally protective of us. And if they feel that it's something that would upset us, chances are they might not share it with us. So I think that if you were to kind of have those conversations up front and say, you know what, this happened to me when I was a child, and I wish I'd spoken to my mama about it, or or whatever the example that you want to kind of share, but just giving them that window of relatability, I think helps in these conversations as well.
Okay, great. That's very, very helpful. Yeah, this happened to me when I was little, or when I was your age, when I went to school. Yeah, I think those things are helpful. Ariana, anything from your end?
Listening to everyone talking is too that sometimes kids, and I speak this from my experience with moving here, is we don't know when we're told certain things as elementary kids or teenagers that may be because of our culture. We don't know that it may be racism or discrimination. We just internalize it. We think it's me, right? And so these conversations with our kids, it's really important because it helps them realize, okay, it's not me. It's not that I'm weird or there's something wrong with me. This is just that everyone's different. Everyone has a different background and a culture. And again, it gives them the language and the words to communicate that. Because I think of, as I learned in graduate school and working with the families now, I look back and I'm like, oh, that's why someone said that to me when I was in high school, or that's why I had that experience. But in that moment, I didn't see it that way. And maybe it's because I just lacked the knowledge.
Okay, it's an interesting perspective as well. Akhila and Anjali, both of you sort of touched upon this a bit. Obviously, we have our own backgrounds and our own stories. So a lot of that by nature just comes into our parenting styles, right? Like sometimes you can't even control it. You sort of see it after it's happened, and then you're like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? Like I was talking to a Singaporean, Chinese, British, Australian couple the other day, and the mum was telling me that she grew up, which is very normal for her mum to give her a little smack, and on the bum. It could be with a cane or with a hand, and she wasn't fully comfortable with talking about it because she herself, she felt that it was so normal, and she was in a relationship with her partner raising kids now, where he was like, whoa, what's that? Like, where's that coming from? And then, as you think about it, she's like, actually, that's not maybe necessary for me to raise my kids just because by nature I was like that. Me personally, Neil's just started a few extracurricular activities, and I sort of suddenly have this tendency of him wanting to do really well. And now with Zoom and everything, I'm sitting like right there, and I'm just like, Neil, you need to kind of say this, like you need to be the guy who actually voices your opinion. Whereas my husband, he couldn't care less, right? He's like, let him just have fun. But that's how I was raised, like, do well and pushing yourself. So I have to sort of hold myself back and let my son have his own journey. So I just want to open that up to the floor a bit. How do you navigate that between you and your partner, and make sure you're on the same page, or at least sort of catch yourself in time before pushing everything onto your child? Anjali, maybe you can go first, as you brought it up earlier.
Yeah, it's a great point. I just think back to what even prompted me into getting into psychology. Like I grew up a child with really big feelings. I'm still a person with really big feelings, and everyone who knows me knows that. Like I'm very excitable, and then when things get upsetting, they're very upsetting for me. And I grew up in a traditional Indian household where feelings were just not okay. And you, especially as a female, you kind of suppress those feelings and you push them aside and you keep it moving. You just figure it out. We don't talk about that, right? We don't talk about sadness. We don't talk about anger. And that, to me, growing up, just felt like it just didn't sit right for me. And when I learned about psychology, I was like, wow, this is really fascinating. Why do certain parents instill these values in their kids? And it came down to values, right? And you learn it's because of their baggage, their history. And we then intergenerationally bring that baggage and that history into our own parenting. What I think has been most helpful is I knew I wanted to do something different when I had my own child. I knew I just kind of wanted to take a different approach where feelings in our house are welcome, no matter how big, how small, whatever they are, they're okay for us. And I do still, the Indian in me, the perfectionist in me, wants to at times correct him when he's having a moment. And I have to catch myself and say, no, it's okay. You're allowed to be angry. You are allowed to be angry. I'm just going to let you be angry for a second, even though it's not perfect looking right now for me. And what that took was my husband and I actually kind of doing like what we would call in psychology, like a values assessment. We had to think about what we valued for ourselves individually, what we valued as a couple, and what we valued culturally, and then what we wanted to bring into the parenting space from those values. So I think a common theme of what's come up here is basically communication is so important. Communication with our partners, communication with ourselves, doing that work for ourselves, and then also with our children and modeling that communication for them. But I do think it's really important we have explicit conversations about those values, how we got to where we are and why we want those values, and what we're going to try and either shift or change or break in our own cycle.
Okay, thank you. And having them well in time. I mean, you know, you don't have to wait for multiple incidences and years to have that. You can start now. You can start anytime. Yeah, thank you. Adi, anything from you? Things to keep in mind with your partner.
And I think keeping in mind that as your child gets older, your parenting will probably shift a little bit, just because your kids are getting more independence. And I mean, 3-year-olds are tough. And I noticed myself, I recently, I was kind of thinking about this talk and thinking of some examples that I recently had. And my daughter has big feelings, and I'll have a reaction when she's upset about something. She looks down and I kind of say, hey, you need to look at me. I'm talking to you. And I realized that that was something that I was told, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I kind of thought to myself, when I'm working with kids in therapy, when they're upset, I don't say, hey, you need to look at me. So why am I doing this to my child? And I had a conversation in that moment with my husband. I was like, hey, were you told to look at your parents when you were like upset? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, okay. And like, I had like this internal thought of like, I don't know if I want to continue doing that. And then the next day I did it again. And I was like, oh, I did it again. So kind of also giving yourself grace that this takes time. I mean, this is something that's ingrained in you from just growing up and what your parents did. And there are definitely things that I truly loved that my parents did, and things that I was like, oh, maybe that wasn't so necessary. But it doesn't mean that my instinct is not to go to that. But definitely giving yourself grace and knowing that these conversations are going to come up, especially as they get older. My parenting is probably going to look very different when she's a teenager than it does now. And there's certain things we can get away with when they're younger, whereas when they're adolescents, they can really kind of challenge us a little bit more. And what's that going to look like? I have no idea, but I'm sure it's going to take a lot of conversations with my husband about what are we going to do in this situation. Yeah. And you may not even think of each situation that comes up, but it is important to kind of reflect and also give yourself grace and allowances every once in a while, because no one knows what they're doing necessarily 100% of the time when they're parenting. And so just recognizing that is huge too.
Yeah, we're all winging it, hey. No, but I think one thing you said is quite interesting, which is a lot of your stuff comes up in that particular period of the child's growing up phase. So like, you know, what you faced when you were 15 or 16 will suddenly come up when they're 15 or 16. You know, like I feel some of the things that are naturally ingrained in me are coming up now that Neil's like 3 or 4. So I guess you just have to wait and see, but just maybe try and anticipate it a little bit, not so much them, but also for yourself, right? Like just your own, you and your partner can talk about it before that phase comes along, or as you start seeing it coming along. Ariana, anything to add?
No, I agree with everything's been said. Again, that communication.
Yeah.
I think I would just add, picking up where Hadi left off, I think that, this sense of, almost like a filter that you put on in terms of just that slight awareness in terms of how you're approaching a situation. And I think that that what we call intentional parenting, you know,
Mhm.
where it's like, okay, there's a situation that happens, because obviously you don't know what the situation is going to happen, but when the situation happens, when you're finding yourself in the middle of the situation, or even after the situation's over, right, you just take that one pause, that one breath, that one moment to say, okay, this is how I reacted, right? Why? What triggered that? Where did it come from? You know, and like, and sometimes you'll find that there's surprises there, and you know, simple things, and you never realize what are the layers of conditioning, right, that we are all carrying with us. And it's not intentional, it's just it's genetic, it's cultural, you know. There's so much of it, like simple things like, you know, my 14-year-old son, there's rose day in school, and you know, very flippantly I asked him, so, you know, which girl are you going to give a rose to, or who are you going to get a rose from? And it's just a very natural thing. And my 14-year-old, you know, so-called kind of grown-up son turns around and says, Mom, you're being stereotypical, what makes you think I'm not going to get a rose from a guy? Right?
Yeah.
And I got called out, you know, and I didn't mean it. It's, I have absolutely no issues with him. You know, whoever, love coming your way, right? I'm happy with that. But suddenly I was just like, that's my background, that's my conditioning coming into play in just casual conversation, right? And these are things that crop up all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's how, when you're sitting down at the table, it's like, you know, just naturally, like if you have a boy and a girl, for example, do I automatically turn to my girl to say, go fetch the, you know, plates? Or do I make a conscious effort to ask both of them to do the chores at the same time? And you know, it's just switching on that one little switch about how am I parenting and what is the, you know, that intention behind it.
Yeah, I think the social conditioning thing is it, like, I think everyone gets called out about it in small ways or big ways. The other day, I think Neil had a little police car, and someone gave it to him, and I was like, "What do you want to name him?" Just came. I didn't think about it. He's like, "No, it's not a boy, it's a girl, and I'll name her Stella or something." I was like, "Oh, actually, okay, that's cool." You know, it just, yeah, and I was just like, "Yeah, that's true. I shouldn't have automatically assumed that would be the case." But yeah, I think intentional, especially like in the early years, is very, very important. Thank you. That's been really, really, really nice conversation. I want to.
Can I make a quick comment?
Please, please.
I just want to comment on both of your parenting, because the fact that your children can correct you in that way, and instead of you two being reactive and take offense to it, you pause and you do the work on yourself and say, oh, wait, you're right. You know, you were giving them.
I was proud of him.
Yeah, exactly. That's amazing. I want to just commend both of you on that, because that's amazing. You've clearly given them the relationship to where they feel safe, and that communication channel is open. And this is how it should be, right? They should challenge us if we're wrong. I want to be corrected, right? If I'm wrong. And we're trying to instill that in them, to do that in spaces of the home. So we want to make sure they feel safe doing it with us. This, it's almost like not necessarily equals, but it's a healthy, safe relationship. And I just commend you both on that, because I think the way the stories that you've shared just clearly illustrate that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would, in your modeling too, like it's okay to be called out when something's not, you don't say something correctly. And I think so many people get so defensive as opposed to using it as a chance to actually ask questions and learn more. So you're modeling how to react in those moments, which is wonderful as well.
I think the slightly side note, but connected, is the apology thing is something, you know, it sort of hit me early on, because growing up, it was never considered okay for an adult to apologize to a child, right? It like, it slows down, and what I say is what you listen to. But there are so many times when I've sort of said, I'm really sorry. You know, either I've lost my temper or I've done something that I've told them not to do, and I say sorry. And it's amazing how they back off and model the behavior really quickly. Like their sorry starts coming so much easily too. And it's not so much offensive, it's just, I genuinely apologize from my heart. So I think that it's still surprising to me, and it's still, I think it's still work in progress, but I think that's one of those things that makes a fundamental change in the relationship, when you kind of equalize, right? Like Anjali was saying, when you foster that connection of authenticity. Yeah, so I think this has been really great, but I do want to sort of close the round on one topic in particular. So we've spoken a lot about raising our kids confidently and making sure our kids are, have freedom of their identity and being open-minded. But I want to ask each one of you on sort of one tip on how do you raise an empathetic child to be kind to others? What is that one or two things that you can do? Because of course, you want your child to be confident and grow up being proud of who they are and where they come from. But you also want to make sure that they don't call someone else out, right? So how do we do that? We can just go around. Anjali, maybe you can go.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is exposure. We call this in the psych world racial socialization. So having access to different types of people, different images, different media, and then also having friends that are different so that they can practice and learn that differences are okay. And I would follow that up with also helping them while they're building their confidence and advocating for themselves, making sure that they're advocating for other people too. If they're seeing that someone else is being wronged, or right now in the US, we're having another racial reckoning moment. And it's really important for those of us groups that have privilege to advocate for those that don't. And that to me is it's non-negotiable, right? And I want to instill that in my kiddo too. Like if you see that there is an injustice, you are to speak on that and help support and stop that from happening. So we do that through books, we do that through videos we watch, we do that through modeling with the things that I do, the things that but we just try and provide language.
Oh, thank you. Adi?
Yeah, I would agree. I think from very early on, all the books that my daughter has they're very diverse. They have all sorts of people, all like anything you can think of, she can find. She has dolls that look different from her. I have like a redhead doll and a white doll and a black doll and a brown doll. So kind of exposing her very early on to those differences and making sure she's aware that they're different because she asks questions and she's very curious. I think the other piece is that, again, going back to just talking to them about what's going on in our daily conversations, she'll bring up things like, so and so did this to me today. And I said, oh, and I kind of start off with like, how did that make you feel? And she'll say, and then I'll say, what did you do? And then she'll kind of then, sometimes, not all the time, she'll say, they're very mean or they're very bad. And I correct her and I said, you know what? It was mean what they did, and they did a bad thing or they made a bad choice, but it doesn't mean they're bad. Maybe they were having a bad day. And so kind of having the conversations about, and I don't know if this is like giving grace to people, but also understanding that people are different and they can have so many different circumstances that affect how they're feeling, and not necessarily and I think don't want her to start labeling herself bad when she has a bad day. And I've seen that a little bit. And so kind of having the conversations about just differences in people's behavior and openly discussing about, like, you don't have to tolerate someone being mean to you, but it doesn't automatically make them a bad person or make them someone you can't interact with later on. And so again, just having those conversations early on and not backing away from them, and not being like, oh yeah, they're bad, don't play with them. She's gotten hit so many times, and my initial instinct is, oh my gosh, stop playing with that kid. Yeah. And then I think children, they're going to play, and not trying to give her the impression that she shouldn't engage with someone because they aren't playing what they want her to play, and things like that. So again, having pretty open conversations with her about, or with them, children in general, not just my daughter, about what should be done in moments when someone's having a bad day or someone says something mean to you. And I think the other piece that I will add is, again, she's 3, so she points out lots of things. So if she points out something that she finds different, I'll kind of normalize it in the moment, so that then she kind of then internalizes, oh, that's just someone has a different way of doing things, or someone does something differently, or someone looks different than me, as opposed to it automatically labeling it like bad different, as opposed to just like, that's normal different. So exposure to everything, definitely.
Separating the act from the person.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And basically being free of judgment. I think that's sort of interesting. Ariana? Any tips?
For me, it's going to be really important to help my daughter understand that not everyone gets to have the same privileged life that she is having. And again, everything was said, that people have stories and backgrounds, and some people experience hardships and stress and discrimination and racism and trauma. And so I want her to not judge the action, not just judge the person by what she's seeing, and understanding that we don't know what people are going through. And I want her to really understand the person and not what she's just observing. So really get to know them and make those connections to not just judge right away.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Akhila?
I think that, for kids they have a very, I mean, we're all like this, kids or adults, people, we naturally gravitate towards like-minded people. We naturally gravitate towards people who look like us. That we have so many stories about, reaching college and finding, that safety net in your own ethnic group, because, there's a shared history, there's a shared cultural base there. So I think that as human nature, it's where we function in herds, so it's just natural for us to gravitate in those scenarios. So even in school and things like that, or in the playground, girls will naturally gravitate towards other girls, boys will gravitate towards other boys, or culturally you might say, okay, the child looks a little bit more like me, so I naturally gravitate towards that child. I think to have these conversations with your children, finding the similarities and the differences, so saying that, okay, we may not look the same, we may not speak the same language, but we both like to play ball, right? And trying to kind of identify, because you will always find something similar and something different. And the minute we start to have those conversations and stress on the fact that we all have similarities and differences, you will find a way to connect with anybody that you meet. It's just about finding that similarity and sticking around long enough for that conversation to figure out, what's similar and what's different, and accepting the differences and connecting on the similarity. So I think that both need to kind of go hand in hand when we're having those conversations with our little ones.
Thank you. That's such a lovely way to end, actually. So thank you very, very much to all of you for joining us. This will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll also send out a link, which will be free for everybody to download as well. So thank you very much for everybody to join us. Thank you.
Thank you.